terms of preparing for this. It's interesting in terms of the audience here, all the people that I've known, and they've taught me. It's kind of ironic that I'm here and they're out there. But in preparing for this, it's kind of an odd challenge because I'm supposed to, in chronology now, it's my turn to talk about how the post-traumatic stress disorder was conceptualized. Yet, in many of the speakers that I've overheard in the hallway, as well as is when I came in, we talked about it already. We talked about sort of the post-PTSD era, or starting to at least. So I want to take you back a little bit, a journey that I've had, my own personal journey, because I've heard a lot of individual testimonials. So I want to sort of shift plans a little bit. I'm going to certainly cover the topic with a quote, I think. But a lot of people are not aware of this, but I was in Vietnam in 65, 66 with the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force. I volunteered to go in the Marine Corps. I volunteered to go to Vietnam, although all of my unit ended up going there, so it would have been moot in many ways. But I love the country. There were a number of people that have talked about that. I respected the people. When we were there, Vietnam Veterans, the Marine Corps People-to-People program was in operation. And on our off time, we volunteered to go into the community, not to act like I'm goody two-shoes, but when my friends were out getting blasted and visiting certain houses of fun, let's say, I was over at the in Da Nang, I remember this very well, at the Catholic orphanage, rebuilding a section, teaching the kids how to play American games, teaching them English, or at least how to pronounce English words, and learning Vietnamese. Oh my. I can still remember certain aspects of this, but I very much appreciated the culture. But at the same time, I was a young Marine and loved being a Marine, loved being in that, and couldn't wait to get to Vietnam. That's why I volunteered. Couldn't wait to be tested because all of my family, my father and his father had always been in the military, and I was very proud to do that. And I still feel proud of my service in the military, in the Marine Corps, 4 years. But as the war, and when we arrived in that time, probably very few people were in Vietnam at that particular time. We landed in Hue. We were not allowed to lock and load our weapon unless we were fired upon. So you had this kind of eerie feeling that you sort of, in your mind, try to figure out how long it would take you to actually be able to defend yourself once you were attacked. And that really stayed until toward the end of the war, because they were very much concerned about the politics of it. They told us that we're just going to go in and practice, sort of use the equipment, make sure it works okay, and then we're coming home, because they'll be very afraid of us, and we're coming over there in force, because we were the first. 3rd Marine Amphibious Force was the first real offensive troops to go in. They had observers protecting certain bases, but we were the first ones to go in force, first at Da Nang, then Hue, then Chu Lai. Everything went fine until people started dying. And I said, gee, this isn't a lot of fun. Missing people that, in other words, it occurred to me that it could happen to me. It was really the first time that I sort of separated myself from John Wayne. I mean, it clearly was not like that at all. But I guess what happened that changed my life significantly was that in our encampment in Da Nang, we, for the first time, had incoming. And it never happened to us before. We were out on operation, search and destroy, quote unquote. It was the first time we were attacked. So I asked the people that we had worked with, mostly kids, about, what's the deal here? In other words, some intelligence work here, so I'll know not to volunteer to be on the line at certain times. Well, apparently what was happening is that the person who owned the land, or at least a portion of the land that we were on in our base, were pissed off because they could not plant that year. And I forget the name of the person. I think I have it written down. There are certain parts of my memory that I can't recall. But from then on, I was worried that I might accidentally shoot this guy, because he certainly was no enemy of mine. And certainly he didn't kill any of the friends that I cared about. So there was this growing ambivalence about the war from my own perspective, and recognizing that we weren't really doing any good over there, and it was getting worse and worse. And the people that I talked to, in terms of my at least minimal language skills, my sense of it was they were very ambivalent about our being there. Well, this was a hell of a blow to someone who was very proud of being in the Marine Corps and having a family with that kind of tradition. So anyway, I got out of Vietnam, came to North Carolina, served the rest of my 4 years there. And it was really, I wanted to put the war behind me. I didn't feel that I had any kind of combat-related stress disorder. Or, as far as I could tell, other people, later on sort of suggested that might not have been true. But it really wasn't until 1968 in Hawaii when basically our country started imploding. As you remember, there was a Tet Offensive. There was Kennedy was shot, Martin Luther King, the Kent State shootings. And I remember very well, I was in an experimental psych class in 1968, and all of a sudden some guy came, another TA actually in the psych department, came in and said, "We're shutting down your class." And all the students got their books together, ready to leave, and I said, "Whoa, wait a second." And I basically started arguing with the guy. And I was extraordinarily ambivalent because on the one hand, I agreed that there should be something explicit that stated that this war is wrong, there's something wrong with it, and we needed to change policy. But on the other hand, I didn't want anyone shutting down my classroom because I paid for it. It wasn't my parents that were paying for it. Okay, well, GI Bill, all right, fine. The government was paying for part of it, that's true. So, altercation, I basically gave him a choice, either go out the door or out the window. And he went out the door. I was going to say window for a second there. So we went on with class, but the point is that at that point in time it forced me to make a decision, a moral decision. Whether I was knowing that the war was wrong and continue to go my own way and move on in my life and make up for 3 or 4 years of lost time, or I was going to do something, I was going to take a stand. And I started taking a stand. It was little stands, fairly small stands, but it was significant to me. And I really never was involved in any kind of peace movement or any kind of protest, but in my own way, in my classrooms and talking with other people. But always I felt this disenfranchisement. I felt always to be marginal. I didn't really feel either with the Hawks or with the Doves. And it was a very strange experience until I discovered the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Now, I know many of you out here have never heard this, and so you're going, what? I joined the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and I have to admit I noticed the Dewey Canyon 3, which was right here in March of 1971, in an ad in Penthouse magazine. There's wonderful articles in Penthouse. A lot of people are not aware of that. I was going through there and I noticed it. So I was a master's student at Penn State, and you laugh, but back then, of course. But I was a master's student at Penn State, very excited about research. I gave up, basically a week of my life to come down here. And something fundamental happened when I was down here that will eventually lead me to why you came here to listen to me. And that is that as I first of all discovered that I was lousy as a demonstrator, even though the future senator from Massachusetts was leading the flock in terms of this. He was also a Vietnam veteran against the war and was one of the organizers for this demonstration. And even though a lot of journalists and other people said that, you're doing good work, this takes a lot of courage, etc., and even though it was a powerful and appropriate cathartic experience for me to throw back my medals on the steps of the Capitol where I ran yesterday morning, I knew that I would not be able to do this because I was too angry. I did not have the patience to go into senators' offices or representatives' offices and to calmly explain why the war was wrong from my own little tiny worm perspective. But one thing I did discover that I was good at, and I was good at doing research. Because as I wandered around on the Oval as we were encamped, particularly at a time when we were being threatened to be thrown off the Oval, and the park police refused to do it, which was great. And watching how my compatriots, my colleagues, my comrades, my fellow Vietnam combat veterans, a part of them started becoming the aggressive force that they were trained to do. All of those memories that they had, if they hadn't remembered it, came rushing back. And that night, the night we almost were thrown off the Oval, there were all kinds of flashbacks, all kinds of problems that these guys were having. Now, we all assumed it was drugs or some sort of psychotic break. But really, it was combat-related post-traumatic stress disorder. So I became fascinated by this. Now, it's kind of pathetic, right? Like, oh, well, let me study this because of all these things. But it was a godsend for me because being a researcher saved me. I think I would have killed somebody or be killed if I had continued in that sort of line of being against the war because there was nothing I could do, not at all, even in 1971. But I could do something about documenting the immediate and long-term psychosocial consequences of war generally, but in particular the Vietnam. So I set about the task of interviewing, and the first person I interviewed was a corpsman. And it occurred to me when I interviewed this guy that he's different than all the others. All the other guys, like myself, were concerned about getting killed, right? Or about feeling a certain amount of guilt about killing, or losing friends of theirs. This guy was afraid and felt bad about losing people in his arms, about people dying on his watch, his being responsible for those people. So it was like 15 years later that I started Conceptualize Compassion Fatigue and published in 1995 the book on compassion fatigue. I always thought about this first interview. But I went back to Penn State, finished my master's degree, started a vet discussion group at Bowling Green State University, started gathering data from that particular group, noticed there was a lot of common features, came back to Penn State for my PhD, and even though it was in experimental social psychology, not clinical psychology, and not social work, I was able to, in the part-time, started to look at this. And finally, in 74, when I finished my PhD, went to Purdue University, that's when I established, soon after that, the Consortium on Veterans Studies. And in the process of doing that, I reviewed the literature, whatever was available out there, to find out who was doing what. Very shortly after that, I discovered John Wilson, Hy Shatton, many others that are in here. I apologize for not remembering you in terms of those early days. But I started the Consortium on Veterans Studies basically to get all of us together, whether we were for or against the war, whether we were a hawk or a dove, to collaborate in trying to pool our resources to try to understand this. Because by the time that happened, by the time I started in 1975, the war was over. And I wasn't interested in talking about the morality or whatever of the war. It was over. What I was concerned about was dealing with those basically walking audiovisual aids of post-war problems, those combat veterans, both women as well as men. So in the process, I met with Hy. He had already long ago, in 71, started rap groups for Vietnam vets that were coming back. He had already, through Jack Smith and Sarah Haley and others, had gotten together and initiated a research project, had already basically outlined the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So when I came along, I added the psychosocial aspects, the secondary aspects, and we pooled our resources that Wade Eisenhart and I were collaborating. I was involved. We analyzed secondary data analysis of a number of data sets that were available, and there weren't very many. So as we went through the late 70s, we collected lots of data, talked with lots of people. We started presenting. Certainly the American Orthopsychiatric was the first one that I went to. But in 1976, right here in Washington, D.C., was the American Psychological Association. And the room was, I think, fairly filled. John was on the panel. In the back of the room was Max Cleland, which connects what we're talking about here. Max was in his wheelchair. I had already met him, I don't know, a month or two ago. Before that, when he was in the Senate, he still was, I think. Yeah, pretty sure. He wouldn't have come as VA administrator to a panel like that. So as a result, I don't know what impact it had on him, but it certainly, because of the number of people that were there, it made an impact on us. American Psychiatric was the next year. And there was this evolution that was emerging here. My book, Stress Disorders Among Vietnam Veterans, was published in 1978. John's collection of research that he had done with disabled American veterans was published about the same time, if not earlier than this. So we had now a critical mass of people that were talking about the war is not over when you leave the military. The war constantly reverberates in the lives of these people, and it doesn't stop with the individual. It also permeates the family, and it permeates the work groups, and wherever this particular combat veteran is involved in. Based on a review of the existing research focusing on psychosocial adjustments of Vietnam veterans, the following conclusions can be made. First, very little attention has been focused on family readjustment problems of Vietnam veterans, particularly in contrast to research interests of World War II veteran families. Second, and it's interesting, today we talked about best practices. There was a specific discussion about the amount of research on family therapy, whether it be with Vietnam veterans or not. It's one of the least researched areas, so you can see how influential I have been in the time I've been around here. The second, pre-service factors including personality, family life, and psychosocial variables appear to be related to in-service and post-service adjustment among Vietnam veterans. It isn't necessarily the preconditions to developing PTSD, but they were important factors because they return to that. Third, Vietnam veterans in general appear not to be significantly different from non-veterans in most areas of interpersonal and intrapersonal adjustment when either service in Vietnam or combat experiences are not controlled. So in other words, they're just like you and me, except being exposed to Vietnam, and that's the major factor. Fourth, there appears to be a considerable evidence which suggests that service in Vietnam is a significant factor in psychological readjustment. There's considerable evidence to suggest that veterans who experience combat in Vietnam are significantly different from others with regard to general and specific orientations to violence, psychological symptoms, indices of depression, political alienation, adjustment problems. There's others, but that's the fifth and final conclusion that we came to in terms of the state-of-the-art in 1978 is that currently, except for the study that Hai and Jack and the others were involved in, that was noted above that I reviewed, there has been very few published reports of attempts to systematically investigate the psychological readjustment process of Vietnam veterans. And this situation appears to be changing, however. A research symposium chaired and sponsored by the Consortium on Veteran Studies attempted as best we could. I talked about 76, 77, and various other things that resulted in this book. So we knew quite a bit back in those days about what was going on with Vietnam veterans. And a very interesting thing, and I'll tell you one more very quick story. As I tried to, we did 2 days of training with the FBI down the street. I'm very proud of this. The FBI paid us a lot of money to train them on how to notice and to treat and be prevented from having compassion fatigue. They're the EAP group that go out and have to deal with all of these special agents in the field dealing with all these kinds of problems. And we were all sort of telling stories around, and I mentioned that I didn't have post-traumatic stress disorder, but I had compassion fatigue. And one of the reasons I had compassion fatigue is all the hundreds and hundreds of war veterans that we worked with in interviews and questionnaires, et cetera, et cetera. It took a toll on me. Now I know why it took a toll on me. It took a toll because when you're traumatized, the best thing to do is to learn from that experience and let it go and move on. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let those lessons that these men and women were teaching me let it go until I had a handle on what the hell was causing this. What were the factors contributing to it? Because I was afraid if I let go of those faces, even though I would avoid dreaming about them later on, if I let go, I would not be able to put the picture together. And it came together one day in Illinois, and it was this story. And John's heard this before, probably many of you have, perhaps. Take a deep breath, Charles, thank you. Internal talk here. I was interviewing this man who was about my age, and that was part of the difficulty in which I identified with him. He wasn't a Marine, but he fit all the profile that was emerging with regard to reasons why he should have post-traumatic stress disorder. He had heavy combat. He came back jobless, and people basically disowned him because of his status as a Vietnam veteran. He had 2 tours over there. He saw people die. He had friends of his die. He wasn't wounded, but yet he was emotionally wounded, and he, in many ways, recognized that. But he didn't have PTSD, even though we didn't know what to call it at that time. He seemed to be happy. He joked around a lot and said, maybe it's the joking. It wasn't that at all. The reason why he didn't have PTSD was because of his mother. And the reason why his mother enabled him to recover from post-traumatic stress disorder, because he then, at that point in time, told me what a mess he was. And it was really sick for me, at least. I felt like, oh, good, great, I'm not wrong then. Like, what? You're wanting this guy to go through misery because you're not wrong? Anyway, he's fine now, or he was fine at the time. But the point is that he was a mess when he came back from Vietnam. He talked about all the difficulties and problems he was having. He told me about one evening in which, about 3 o'clock in the morning, he estimated, he was sitting there with a loaded pistol and 1/4 of Jack Daniels left. And his mother, as she later told it, saw him there without his noticing that she had arrived, which is sort of unusual for Vietnam combat veterans, but we'll let that go for a while. But that was a Jack Daniels, thank you. Thank you. Now that helps in terms of understanding it. So his mother came in and very quietly sat down with him. And then she then proceeded to say, you're very depressed now, aren't you? Yes. You feel like killing yourself, don't you? Yes. You feel that no one really understands what you've gone through, right? Right. You have nightmares at night, right? He's never told her this. Yeah. You have startle responses in which someone just jumped and you jumped, right? Right. She basically went down all of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And he looked at her, okay, with the Jack Daniels fog, and said, how the hell do you know this? Because he already felt valued, he felt recognized, he didn't feel alienated, or at least he felt that she was honoring him by noticing this, because he certainly wasn't that way when he went to Vietnam. And she looked into his eyes and said, I know this because I've experienced this myself. Now, as he told me, that's impossible because she sure as hell didn't go to Vietnam. Well, come to find out that she had never, ever, not once, told anyone that 6 years before that time, actually when he was in Vietnam, she was raped. And that all these symptoms that he was experiencing, she noticed in herself. As a matter of fact, she felt in many ways better, if you can believe that, because she noticed it in himself. So as a result, she explained to him what she has been doing about that. She's written extensively about it. She has faced the person who raped her. Basically, she shared her journey with him about how she was able to get over this. And together, she in effect provided a guide for him in being able to recover from this experience. For me, that was an extraordinary finding, for me. Because for me, it then enabled me to say, yeah, this is not limited just to Vietnam veterans. It's not just because of the particular war that we fought. It isn't just because of our being in combat or being afraid of dying or any of the, well, it's certainly important, but it's a necessary but not sufficient condition to cause PTSD. It really is a complicated fear response. It's something that other people share. So it was immediately, at that point in time, I started expanding the literature. I started my review of the literature. I went immediately to the literature that Ann Burgess had written about, and Holmstrom, and all the other people that talked about rape victims and survivors. I started reading the Holocaust literature. I started reading the Buffalo Creek Dam disaster and the special issue of the American Psychiatric. And it was because of that I was able to begin to let go of some of all of these memories, because I then recognized that it was much more complicated than just war. And as a result, and this was the wonderful part, we could look to other people who've worked with other kinds of traumatized people to find out what they've used to assess this, what they've used to treat this, and in effect to try to prevent these problems from happening. And it was about 5 or 6 years later, well after the DSM-3, that I met my wife at Princeton University on sabbatical, in which there was a funded research project that brings all of these various victim groups together to try to look at the common causes as well as the common solutions. So we've come a long way. And as I look out at ISCSS and 1,000 people here, my heart leaps. Because all of us can collaborate in sharing what we know best and from our own experiences, and to be able to put all of this together to try to notice the tapestry of this complex phenomenon that we can, shorthandedly call post-traumatic stress disorder or just the trauma response. And now we don't have to do this alone. And now we don't have to walk around with all of this stored in our head. We can share it and let it go, publish, and move on. Way to go. We did it. And a lot of it had to do with the experiences of the people here and the work that they've done. Way to go.